21 years ago, UNESCO delivered resolution number 29, which condemned violence against journalists. That was in 1997. They have now recently, in response to the increased death and imprisonment of journalists, chosen November the 2nd, and I want to promote it to you, as International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. And I'm hoping that you can all support that. And you can do so with hashtag #TruthNeverDies. And so 2nd of November, now the date was chosen to commemorate the assassination of two French journalists, Ghislaine Dupont and Claude Verlon, who were both killed in Mali many years ago. So I'd like to start, if I may, with Rebecca, who I'm hoping can set up with a few statistics, give us a bit of an understanding of the nature of the problem we're trying to deal with the imprisonment and the killing of journalists. Sorry? Oh no! We're going to come later. Don't worry. We've got a special place there for that. Don't worry. So Rebecca, if you could.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, this is going to be a bit sobering in terms of global trends. So this year, as of today, we've seen 75 journalists, citizen journalists, and media workers killed already. To put that into perspective, last year in all of 2017, 65 journalists were killed. So by the end of August this year, we had already surpassed year-end figures from last year. That means 2018 is already set to be one of the deadliest years on record. So far this year, the deadliest countries are Afghanistan, Syria, Mexico, Yemen, and the United States, if we're looking at top 5 in terms of figures of journalists killed this year. At the end of every year, we publish a roundup which analyzes the trends of every given year. So that's not out for this year yet, it will be around New Year. But looking at our analysis from 2017, some figures within that might be of interest. So journalists are still being killed in conflict zones. But less and less, and that's because, in part, foreign journalists are not traveling as often to the most dangerous spots, and local journalists in the most dangerous places are having to flee. So what we're seeing is a sort of shift in the trend here. Last year, 60% of the journalists that were killed were actually targeted intentionally. Many of these were investigative journalists covering corruption and other risky beats. They were intentionally targeted. 40% were journalists that were killed in the field doing their jobs. So this year, actually last year, it's worth mentioning that the figure of women journalists killed doubled from the year before. So 10 women journalists were killed in 2017 as compared to 5 the year before. And that's a trend that we're seeing continue through this year. So keep an eye out for analysis at the end of this year. I want to talk in depth a little bit later about one of those cases, Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed in Malta last year. Just to touch on imprisonment as well, because imprisonments of journalists are also taking place for political reasons all over the world, also with impunity. As of today, 339 journalists, citizen journalists, and media workers are imprisoned around the world. So the biggest prisons for journalists and citizen journalists this year in terms of numbers are China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. And not far behind, in fact, just one case behind those are Syria and Vietnam. So we'll see where they land at the end of the year as well. So we're seeing impunity all over the world. Jamal Khashoggi is still getting international headlines, and I won't go too much into that because I know other speakers will cover that, but that is a great example of the bold-faced impunity now that such attacks are taking place. The idea that somebody could go into a diplomatic mission and ultimately lose their life is beyond comprehension, or should be beyond comprehension, but this unfortunately seems to be now part of the norm. To put that into perspective, in Saudi Arabia, before Jamal Khashoggi's death had been confirmed, we pointed out that he's not the only Saudi journalist to have gone missing. Since September 2017 alone, we know of 15 other journalists who have presumably been detained, but many of them that have not been confirmed, their whereabouts are not known. So some of them have kind of gone missing. And in total now, we know of at least 28 other journalists and citizen journalists that are behind bars in Saudi Arabia. So what's happened now to Jamal Khashoggi, while horrific and while it deserves special attention because of the nature of this crime against him, is actually not out of the norm in terms of the treatment of the Saudi regime of journalists. And the fact that now in Turkey, President Erdogan has now become the sort of defender of the free press when it comes to the Khashoggi case is a bit incomprehensible, actually. Turkey has long been, there's been problems for many years, but since the failed coup attempt in 2016, in July 2016 to be more precise, he has overseen this relentless press freedom crackdown. So over 150 media outlets have been shut down in Turkey. Dozens of journalists are behind bars. A number of very prominent journalists have recently been sentenced to life in prison. Their conditions in prison are appalling. And this continues. Many journalists are standing trial nearly every day in Turkey in mass trials. How can you possibly achieve justice in such cases? So Turkey is currently 157th out of 180 countries on our World Press Freedom Index, and Saudi Arabia is 169th. I want to turn to Europe, though. I talk a lot about this here in the UK. I think just over a year ago, the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia was a wake-up call for many of us. She was killed by a car bomb in broad daylight in an EU state on the 16th of October 2017. At the time, that was shocking, but what you see now, in the just over a year that's passed, is actually that this is now becoming the new norm in Europe. 4 months after Daphne was killed, and I do want to return to her case because I've just come back from Malta last week, actually, but just 4 months after Daphne was killed, another investigative journalist, Ján Kuciak, was murdered in Slovakia. He was also somebody who was pursuing stories related to official corruption. And just last month in Bulgaria, we saw the murder of a TV presenter who was working on things related to these investigations, Viktoria Marinova, which we haven't yet been able to confirm that was linked to her work. And I see that the Bulgarian government is very busy trying to make it appear that it was not connected to her work. We don't know that yet. But the fact of the matter is that journalism, in particular investigative journalism, has become far too risky on this continent. In Italy as well, we know of around 200 Italian journalists that are currently under police protection, and Italian police foiled an assassination plot recently of a plot against Paolo Bramati, who is an expert in the Sicilian mafia. So this year in our World Press Freedom Index, Europe as a region, this is the region that respects press freedom the most, but it was also the region this year that declined the most in our index, with 4 out of 5 of the countries with the sharpest declines being European countries. 3 of these were EU countries. So at the top, Malta, which dropped 18 places to 65th, Slovakia dropped 17 places down to 27th, and the Czech Republic dropped 11 places down to 34th. Just lingering on the Czech Republic for a minute, I want to highlight the behavior recently of their president, Miloš Zeman, who styles himself as the Czech Donald Trump, who just 2 days ago, he often makes jokes that are actually maybe not so funny and incite violence towards journalists. This week he said, "I love journalists, that's why I may organize a special banquet for them this evening at the Saudi embassy." So this is the man who last October waved a dummy Kalashnikov at a press conference that was inscribed with the words "for journalists," and a few months prior had joked again that journalists should be liquidated. So this is what's happening on our continent, and I often feel like I'm scaremongering here in the UK. Luckily here, we are not yet working on cases of violence, but it is not unthinkable that this could also happen here. We don't have so inflammatory as a figure as Miloš Zeman, but we do have public officials that are contributing to this sort of distrust of media, this sort of, that engage in this media bashing, and it is actually dangerous. Daphne Caruana Galizia's case has really, I think, taken on so much significance. She has become, in many ways, symbolic of many of the things that we're working on: safety of journalists, the risks facing investigative journalists, bloggers. Because in addition to the investigative journalism that we know her for, including work on the Paradise Papers, she was a political commentator in Malta. In fact, the prominent political commentator there, and her acerbic writing on her blog may have been what had her killed. And of course, risks of women journalists. But what's remarkable about Daphne's case is that more than a year later, momentum has not faded. Actually, it continues to build. So last week I took part in a freedom of expression mission to the country with 5 other press freedom and free expression groups to look into the climate there, and what we found won't surprise you. It's a climate that that allowed for a journalist to be murdered, and that a full year later, actually there's been no real progress in finding the masterminds behind her attack. No real justice for Daphne. Not only that, not only did we find that the investigation is not satisfactory, there's bizarre things happening still, like posthumous defamation lawsuits being continued against her over a year after she died. And these are not just private individuals. This is the Prime Minister himself, his Chief of Staff, his Minister of Tourism, and others connected to his government that are continuing to try to discredit her work a year after her murder. In addition, on a near daily basis now, the memorial to her honor, the protest memorial, actually demanding justice for Daphne, is being cleared. At first it was being sort of destroyed in the dead of night, perhaps by overzealous supporters, but now it's being done under government orders. So this is all really worth watching in Malta. And because Daphne's case has taken on this symbolic quality, because momentum is continuing to build, we really feel that if we persevere here, if we can find anything resembling justice in this case, it will have a knock-on impact on our work for safety of journalists throughout Europe and actually internationally. So I have a few things about steps forward, but I know I've spoken longer than I'm meant to, so I'll leave that perhaps for the Q&A.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you, Rebecca. But now I know that Safa has to go. She's very kindly extended her hotel stay so she can speak to us, and so I want to go to her now so we can let her go. Safa, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Safa, I wonder if you could explain a little bit about the sort of Turkish-Saudi tension that we've seen in regards to the Jamal Khashoggi matter, because I know you're very familiar with Turkey as well. But also, there's been this Muslim Brotherhood label applied to Khashoggi, and I wanted to know what that means.
Right. I mean, the irony of all ironies that Erdogan has become the savior of the issue of a Saudi journalist, and as Rebecca was saying, Turkey has the worst record actually in how many journalists in prison, and so the irony is not lost on the rest of us who are familiar with the story. And so I think the reason why the Jamal Khashoggi case is still in the news is sadly because the story has been caught between three different countries, so Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United States as well, and everybody has their own vested interest in how they present the case. If we're going to talk about Saudi Arabia actually doesn't even, I think as a government, doesn't even understand what is the role of a journalist, and they've put so many in prison, as Rebecca had said as well, purely if we're talking to people that don't agree with the Saudi government. And to talk directly to why this whole issue with the Muslim Brotherhood with Jamal Khashoggi, it's because the Saudis and the Emiratis had, I think a year or two ago, declared them a terrorist organization. And so part of the whole trolling and the propaganda on the Saudi side was trying to discredit him as a journalist by saying that he belongs to this group. And to me, it's irrelevant if he belongs to this group or not. It doesn't mean that you can assassinate him in your consulate. And so there's a lot of attempt on all sides to change the narrative of who Jamal Khashoggi is and to justify the killing or the defending of, depending on where they are. The Qataris are also involved in this and leaking a lot of stuff and pushing their narrative through Jazeera as well about who he is, as part of a vendetta against Saudi Arabia. And so in a strange way, this is one of the reasons I don't think any of these countries actually care about Jamal Khashoggi as a person or about journalism. They just find it the most opportune time to use his case against other people. And this is sadly, Saudi Arabia has been doing this with impunity for ages, and in Yemen as well, they're attacking journalists on the ground there, and they're making it extremely difficult for journalists, even foreign journalists who come into the country, to be able to work. And so touching on the whole concept of investigative journalism becoming more dangerous, I would completely agree with that, because front lines are easier in a way because you can see them, you can have calculated risks about how you manage your level of danger in a front line when you're in a war zone. But with investigative journalism, you're constantly paranoid, and you're sitting here wondering, do they know where I am? Do they know who I'm talking to? Am I safe? Am I not? And so it's constantly a guessing game between you and how safe you are. And now with digital security, it's nearly impossible to disappear. And so it is so much easier for governments like Saudi Arabia, who have nearly unlimited resources, and so is the American government, and staying steps ahead of you as an investigative journalist. And that weighs heavily, I think, on all of us, how to remain safe ourselves, how to keep our contacts safe, how to do a story in the most ethical way possible and stay alive. And so all of these issues are really I think none of us have any answers to this, but it's becoming more and more dangerous for us. And what the Jamal Khashoggi case sadly shows is that governments feel that they can do this with impunity, and he's just the tip of the iceberg. He just happened to be killed in the consulate. He could, if his fiancée wasn't outside, he could have just simply disappeared, and they would have taken no responsibility whatsoever for him.
But how does it affect you, Safa, as a Saudi journalist? I mean, will you be going to a Saudi consulate anytime soon? Do you need any marriage?
No. I mean, I was accused of supporting terrorism way earlier than this Crown Prince had taken office. So I had left in 2014, and they had written an actual complaint letter saying that I supported terrorism because I interviewed protesters that said something that was against the narrative that the Saudi government wanted to represent. And so already they have these really problematic concepts of what is terrorism. So journalism to them is terrorism. And they say, I'm sure Peter would agree with me in his experience in Egypt. They have no shame about what they can claim about us and our work. And with this Trump administration that has shown such clear disregard and disrespect for journalism as well, there's no one to put pressure on these governments to even pretend to respect journalism as an institution or us as journalists. And as for me, I mean, it is really hard when you think that you try not to be too paranoid about your work. But now with what happened with Jamal, it's like the craziest things right now. And we're all, I think, still digesting what Jamal's killing means for us, and especially with all these rumors of this, they had an actual program to detain and kidnap and journalism to them is dissent. So I really don't know. I have no words for this shit. Like, this is just beyond.
Safa, I noticed that Laurent's just come on the call,
Yes.
Which is excellent. Now, I know you have to shoot off. I just wanted to thank you for your time and staying in your hotel an extra half an hour so you could speak to us. So on behalf of us all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Laurent.
Hi.
Hey, hi, Laurent. Hey,
yes.
Thank you for coming in on your mobile phone. I think you're coming in on your mobile phone. I wanted you, and I know we haven't got much time for you, and I promised you we'd be very quick.
That's fine, no problem. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it, Laurent. Laurent, first of all, we'd like to congratulate you on your amazing award at the Prix Europe as European Journalist of the Year. But what we're really interested in is your extraordinary work with Forbidden Stories. Now, I'm going to show the film once we finish with you. We'll show the film, so people are going to see that. The one you sent me. But can you explain what you're doing? And I know that you're going to want to speak about Malta a bit.
Yes. Well, basically, Forbidden Stories is a non-profit devoted to continuing the work of jail or assassinated reporters. The main idea of Forbidden Stories is to keep the stories alive and making sure people get access to critical information. And we do think that when a journalist gets killed for one story, that probably means that the story is very relevant to the public opinion. And when you look at why the journalists get killed or get jailed, get arrested, get censored, actually they were working on environment, corruption, money laundering, and so important issues for the public opinion. So that's why we created that. It's with a very journalistic goal in informing and investigating sensitive issues for the public opinion.
Now, you mentioned something called the Streisand effect. What is the Streisand effect?
Well, the Streisand effect is a philosophy of the Streisand effect is to shed the light of something you wanted to hide. Basically, with the Streisand effect, I think on the Maltese case, is Daphne Caruana Galizia was working on corruption, money laundering in Malta. Malta is part of Europe. Malta is a member state, and I think that right now we were talking a lot about the money laundering, the corruption in Malta, probably way more than before the killing of Daphne. The Streisand effect is based on the story of Barbara Streisand that in 2002, a photographer in California decided to make just a picture of the coast of the California and the erosion of the coast. That was the subject. He published the picture on a website, very confidential website, with only 3 or 4 views after 1 or 2 months. But Barbara Streisand was not happy at all, because on the picture you can see the house of Barbara Streisand. And so she decided to ask 2 lawyers of her to sue him and ask millions of dollars to as a settlement for having publishing the picture. So, but because she took some lawyers, many journalists went to the trial, went to the courtroom, and decided to talk about the trial. And by the way, we're publishing the picture of the house with the house of Barbara Streisand. So that's why we call now the Streisand effect, when you are in the light and you wanted to hide something.
No, that's fantastic. Well, what's very exciting about what you're doing is it gives us perhaps a little bit of hope, because what you're doing, it seems, is you're ensuring that there's a disincentive to kill journalists. Isn't that right?
Yeah, one of the things we are doing with Forbidden Stories is we want to have a conversation we do have usually in the newsroom in Paris, in London, in New York, when you are going into a sensitive interview because you are investigating into a dangerous story. You talk to your editor-in-chief and you say, I think it's going to be dangerous, or I received 2 days ago this threat. So if something happens to me, you're going to find the materials, my sources, or the information in this part, or to this place, in that to these people. And so most of the journalists who get killed are usually alone, freelancer, they are only publishing on Facebook. What we do try with Forbidden Stories is we want to recreate that kind of conversation with people who are at risk, who are far away from us. And we want to offer them a possibility to protect their stories while they are investigating. So basically, they can send through Signal, through Secret Drop, or PGP, 3 ways, very secure, to send information. And in case something happens, then we will be able to continue the work. So that's something we try. We try to bring to set up a big network of journalists at risk who wants to protect their stories, and we will be ready to continue.
Laurent, I promise not to take too much of your time. Thank you so much. And
No
we're going to
problem.
watch your film. We're going to watch your film, but we're also going to clap you because we think what you've done is amazing.
Thank you.
Daphne Caruana Galizia
killed when a bomb exploded.
Connected to the aggressive work she had done calling out corruption in Malta.
Forbidden Stories was created as a platform to protect stories of silenced journalists. Threatened journalists can back up their sensitive information through one of our encrypted channels. Their stories will be held securely in case something happens. Forbidden Stories will be able to access the stories, complete them thanks to its partners, and reveal it broadly. The first Forbidden Story was about Daphne. We coordinated the work of 45 journalists to review a massive number of files in a complete secrecy and complete Daphne's investigations with one common objective: revealing what her killers wanted to hide. 6 months after her death, we hit the news.
An international consortium of journalists is scrutinizing Malta as part of the so-called Daphne project.
In one day, and for weeks, Daphne's stories made the headlines all over the world.
Forbidden Stories, an international network of journalists
designed to finish these stories and the investigations that we're working on.
In a week, hundreds of millions of people have been potentially exposed to Daphne's stories, dramatically increasing the number of readers of her blog. This is how a local investigation became an international affair.
The European Commission will pursue this. We will keep pushing the Maltese authorities. We will keep pushing them. No stone should remain unturned.
Today, we gave Daphne a new voice And as long as journalists will be threatened, jailed, or killed, we will keep stories alive.
But the more I thought about it, the more I realized two things. The first is that what had happened to us was really a small, egregious example of the kinds of things that we've been talking about, the kind of thing that's been happening all over the world. But also that in my own career, in a lot of ways, I tracked a lot of the attacks on journalism. And so what I wanted to do was tell the kind of parallel narratives, first of all, of what was taking place in Egypt during our arrest and a trial and subsequent imprisonment and the struggle to get us out of Egypt, but also the larger narrative about what was happening across the world since 9/11. And I think for me what the turning point was around 9/11, around 2001. For two reasons. The first was the obvious technological changes, which everyone has spoken about, the way in which journalists started to become irrelevant, or not necessarily irrelevant, but became unnecessary to the belligerents in conflict, so that they no longer needed to work through us to deliver their stories. And in many cases, when we started to mediate those stories, we got in the way of the propaganda that the authorities were trying to tell. And so it actually became necessary to get us out of the way, either through arrest or imprisonment or murder. And we became targets in ways that we hadn't been before. But there was something else I think that really changed. And I remember back in 1995 when I was a correspondent for the BBC in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and we used to cross the front lines all the time. You would have experienced that yourself. And of course the people on the other side of the lines were the Taliban. The Taliban knew about us, they wanted us to tell the story because we were observers rather than participants. Governments also encouraged us to make that journey because they also wanted us to interrogate all of the parties to the dispute to understand what was going on. If we fast forward into 2001, what we saw was the conflict shift. We saw conflicts of the past over tangible things that you could stick your finger on, whether it was land or water or ethnicity. Then we saw after 9/11 a conflict over ideas. And the place in which ideas are transmitted becomes by definition a part of the battlefield. And so what we saw was a US bomb fall on the Al Jazeera bureau after they'd been able to get the one interview that I'd wager every journalist in the world wanted at that time, and that was with Osama bin Laden. Now whatever you think of the rights or wrongs of that interview, the fact is that the Americans dropped a bomb on a news network for telling a story that they felt uncomfortable about. It wasn't just the Americans, of course. The Taliban intercepted a convoy that was carrying a group of journalists who I know Vaughan knew very well. I was very close to one of those journalists as well. The wonderful Italian journalist Maria Grazia Gattuli, there was the Australian journalist Harry Burton, a whole bunch of them. And the Taliban pulled them aside, let the rest of the convoy go, and they murdered those journalists. These weren't casual victims. These guys weren't caught in the crossfire. They weren't in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were singled out and murdered because they were journalists. And I think that was one of the first incidents in which we saw the dynamic change. And so increasingly what's happened is that journalists have become targets in this conflict because we are seen in some form of this battle of ideas, a part of the battle space. What happened to us in Egypt, was a part of that struggle, particularly when it comes to the criminalization of journalism. And we heard those statistics earlier. The thing, I guess, the point that I would like to make about that is that if you dive deeper into the statistics, 3/4 of them, of those people, the journalists that are in prison, are there on what we'd loosely consider to be anti-state charges. Things like terrorism, like treason, like sedition. The Egyptians, in our case, insisted, and quite rightly so, that they've got very strong constitutional guarantees for press freedom. Press freedom is protected under the Egyptian constitution. And they said that actually we don't have journalists in prison because those guys aren't journalists, they're terrorists, they're criminals. And increasingly what we're seeing, as those statistics show, we're seeing the criminalisation of something that was so fundamental to the functioning of a democracy. And the rhetoric is continuing to shift in the wrong direction, and that's why we need to push back. That's why we need to keep having these conversations.
Your book talks about how the war on journalism has somehow spread from the battlefields of the Middle East. Could you explain that?
Yeah, it's really, the thing that really disturbs me is the way that the war on terror changed the dynamic. George W. Bush said it very succinctly. In this war, he stood up at a joint session of Congress and said, in this war you are either with us or you're with the terrorists. And it made it a binary choice. And for journalists, what that meant was that we couldn't do the job that we used to do, where you interrogate all parties to the conflict. Think back, as I said, to Al Jazeera's interview of Osama bin Laden. It made it impossible to cross the line in pursuit of our most fundamental responsibility as journalists, to speak to all parties without violating that line, without crossing the line that George W. Bush made. And since then, governments around the world have used national security as an excuse to tighten the space that journalists are able to operate in. Again, you mentioned that earlier. The fact that journalism is becoming criminalised. Even in my country, in Australia, the government has started to criminalise various parts of there's a new piece of legislation that was passed, the ASIO Act. It's called Section 35P of the ASIO Act, which gives the government, the minister, the power to define any intelligence operations as special intelligence operations. So if you report on that, if you even reveal the existence of that operation, you can find yourself in prison for 5 years, up to 10 years if that's decided to be aggravated disclosure. The problem is that we don't know which operations have been defined as special intelligence operations. So if you start doing your job as a journalist and you investigate the work of the intelligence agencies, which I would argue is a fundamental responsibility of any good journalist, then the chances are at some point you are going to find yourself violating Section 35P of the ASIO Act and find yourself in court trying to explain why you shouldn't have to go to prison.
I mean, there's more than 300 people, 300 journalists in prison across the world, isn't that right? You've got some statistics. How many do RSF feel there are at the moment?
339 as of today, and this goes up every single day. But I think Peter's touched on a really important point, and one actually that we should be worried about here in the UK. The biggest thing I'm working on here at the moment is the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill, which has provisions that actually could be used very similarly as we're seeing in other countries.
And there's more than 300 other journalists around the world suffering in the same way. What is their experience? Can you help us understand what they're going through here?
Yeah. What happens, I mean, what happened to us was quite a shock. I mean, I've done a lot of work in all sorts of places where I've expected a knock on the door from and a jackboot in from the authorities. But Egypt wasn't one of those. I was doing what I considered to be pretty mundane journalism. We weren't pushing boundaries. We weren't doing anything that I thought was particularly dramatic or threatening. And so when the police came in and arrested us, we thought, they're just rattling a cage, it'll be over in a day or two. We'll have to spend maybe a night in the cells, but there'll be some phone calls, it'll all blow over. When it became clear that this was not going to blow over, when we knew that we were facing the terrorism charges, that was the point at which we recognised that this was a hell of a lot more serious than we ever imagined. Excuse me. And it was, as journalists, we take this eye of God approach to stories. We kind of like to think of ourselves as detached, as neutral observers. And even though the statistics are showing that we can no longer think of ourselves in those terms, when we're out there reporting, we often, that's a narrative that we tell ourselves. So that when we're dragged into this kind of conflict, when we're accused of promoting terrorist ideology, it comes as a hell of a shock, because I don't know how many of us are really psychologically prepared for the prospect of going to prison for what we do. I think a lot of local journalists understand that far better than foreign correspondents like ourselves, because they have to deal with this sort of thing every day. But for us, it was like a punch in the guts, because we just had no idea it was coming.
So what was it like after a month? What was it like after 6 months?
After a month, you kind of have to come to terms with the fact that this is going to take a while. After a month, what you need to do is shift your psychology. Because one of the things I realized is, very quickly, is that we were, because of the international pressure, we were spared some of the worst physical abuses within the Egyptian judicial system. They didn't torture us, they didn't physically beat us up, although we know, I saw a lot of other inmates who were. And so we had food. It wasn't always great, but we had it. We had water and we had shelter, the basic things that you need for survival. And in that environment, you realise the one thing that's going to get you is your own head. And unless you are able to manage your head, unless you're able to manage your psychology, it's your own head that'll kill you in the end. But if you're constantly thinking, I'm going to get out tomorrow, that's when you know that you're going to be in trouble. People keep saying, well, you must have had hope. Hope must have kept you going. In fact, the thing that you had to do, the thing that I learned to do, was to abandon hope. Because it was the dashing of hope. Every day, if you hoped to be released, every day that you went to bed without being released was another day that hope got knocked. And eventually that gets incredibly depressing. So you actually have to get to the point where you accept that these four walls is the reality that I have to deal with today, probably tomorrow, and that I have no control over this. And when you accept that you have no control, when you accept that simply surviving is a form of resistance, that's when you are in a better position to actually survive it and get through it. But that takes a while to get to that point.
Sure it does. Sure it does. Now, you were got out, and one of the people who helped you get out is here. We are lucky enough to have the Latvian ambassador here, Vaida Marinova, who actually, the Latvian ambassador who is here today, applied a lot of pressure, I understand, to actually get you out. Because you are actually half Latvian, aren't you?
I am half Latvian.
You call yourself Australian, but that's not the entire truth.
I didn't know. Let me tell you this. I didn't know that I was a Latvian citizen until someone smuggled in a story into the prison, and I was described as a Latvian Australian journalist. And I thought, hang on a minute. And then they quoted a Latvian official. You know how everybody complains that their passport photo looks like a prison mugshot? Well, mine really was. They came and issued the passport in prison. And the Australian government, I have to give a lot of credit to the Australians for fighting very hard too, but equally I'm also very proud of the support that I got from Latvia, because it was really all a part of that mix.
I was hoping that Vaida might actually talk to us a little bit, because she's got some concerns. The Latvians got some concerns about the press as well, which extend our understanding of what the problems are. So I'm wondering if we could have a microphone. Would you happily stand up and talk to us? Is that possible? So anyway, I'm very grateful to have a Latvian ambassador here, and we have the worst microphone in London.
You can also scream.
And it'll only work. I'm going to replace it. But you have to you have to speak very close to it to work. You have to kind of nearly eat it. So anyway, Ambassador, if you could actually talk a little bit about how you helped Peter, but also about your concerns about the media today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here at the Frontline Club, and Peter, great to have you here physically. The Latvian government, the fact that Peter is half Latvian is not a coincidence. There is a big Latvian community in Australia, and his father is Latvian, and Peter is Latvian, so it comes naturally to us, of course, when we heard the story that Peter Greste is in prison in Egypt, and the name and family name clearly indicated to us that he might be Latvian. We checked and he was Latvian. So we asked his parents, is there anything that actually we might be helpful, and we consulted also our Australian colleagues. And it was one of the closest collaborations, I think, possible on consular issues at the time, and it worked, so we're happy it worked. Why? Why was it important for Latvia? We're 100 years old, but half of that time we were occupied by the Soviets. So we didn't have freedom of expression, even though it was in our constitution when Latvia was established in 1918. We didn't have a chance to write the stories of our own. We didn't have a chance to tell them. So now it's really important that you guys tell the stories. Journalism is the fourth estate. It's not 3 powers, it's 4 powers. And for Latvia, as a government, as a country, we feel that we are only 1.5 million market, English-speaking audience. It's difficult to get to. We have the same issues as all the other democracies, whether that's technology, whether that's the wish to control the narrative of certain forces. Money, everything is there. Lack of job security for journalists. So the quality media, quality journalism is most important for us. So what we had done actually in the years since regaining the independence is not only legal and regulatory issues, but actually very practical issues, practical steps. One, we established a media fund, which is a sort of money given by the government, but it's firewalled. The government doesn't have influence how it's distributed. So it's the journalists themselves who decide who gets what investigative project, what research project, what they need, who deserves it, what criteria. So the government doesn't really know whether it will be against some of the government officials or whether that will be a climate issue or something else. We supported, again by money, by seed money, establishment of Baltic Media Center of Excellence, where journalists with the best knowledge in certain fields are able to transfer that to their peers, whether within Latvia or within the Baltics or other countries. So we have had people, from former Yugoslavia, from Eastern Europe, be it Belarus, Ukraine, other countries, actually having a time to think, to upgrade themselves, to learn the latest technological tools, to understand what is happening, what other countries are going through, what recourses they have in terms of legal issues and so on and so forth. But we also have worked really on the security issues, because for us, democracy is not something, and freedom is not something we take for granted. It's part of something it's worth defending. 3 generations were destroyed by Soviets, by Nazis, and by Soviets again, in their understanding of how the world works, or what you can say, what you can't say. So for us, there is the ultimate issue of freedom. So Peter, that's why we committed when you were there. And I do hope this is one evening we don't discuss Brexit, please.
I'm going to get any surprise support named Smith. Anyway, Rebecca, why is this happening to us?
I think a few reasons really. Maybe the changing nature of journalism. I think these collaborative investigations that we're seeing now have been really impactful. So when we're looking at the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, these sorts of stories, I think the consequences are becoming bigger for those who desperately actually want to keep these things hidden. That in itself is making it riskier. I think the fact now that so much, is this still working?
That was her over there with my crappy microphone.
I prefer this one. I think the fact now that many citizen journalists now are communicating more directly with their audiences. This puts journalists at risk in a very direct way. We're seeing, for example, some of the cases of citizen journalists murdered in Mexico. Somebody can upload a video to Facebook and be killed for that. I mean, so things like that are changing it. But I think also it's really just a question of the continued impunity. Impunity breeds impunity, and so the more that people get away with this, the more that others are going to continue to use it. That's why we have to up the consequences. That's why we have to, things like forbidden stories, things like the campaigning that we're doing, the legal efforts that are ongoing as well in parallel to this work are really important, because we have to start to actually hold people accountable in some of these cases, in any of them. And I have some things in the way of recommendations. I don't know if now is a good time to talk about that.
Before you do, can we just remind when you mentioned impunity, I don't think you mentioned that one statistic which still shocks me every time I hear it. Of all of the journalists that have been murdered, 9 out of 10 cases are unsolved. 90%. Think about that. Think about what that means, not just for us journalists, but think about what that means for anybody who's thinking of topping a journalist. And the only conclusion you can come to is that there are 2 reasons for that. Either the authorities don't care, or they're complicit. Either of those is shocking, is a shocking indictment. But just hold on to that number for a bit and understand what it means. Then you start to get to the crux of it.
And often even in the cases where there are arrests, often it's sort of the small fry involvement. So for example, in Daphne Caruana Galizia's case, the government will say to us, well, we've arraigned three persons that are very likely to have been involved in the actual carrying out of the attack, but there's been nothing done in the way of getting at the masterminds. And very, very rarely do we actually see that.
Who are the victims these days, and who's killing them?
Well, in so many cases, we don't actually know. We know why they're at risk, and it's still journalists going to the very dangerous places, or actually more frequent than that, the local journalists that are covering conflict, for example, in Afghanistan. But it's often, as we said, investigative journalists, those exposing corruption, those covering human rights abuses, things that powerful interests, whether it's states, whether it's criminal interests, whether it's commercial interests, that powerful people want to keep hidden.
Well, I mean, I think we don't like it being about us. We'd like to just get on with our job, wouldn't we? We don't really want to be a story about us. And when it is, and this event's about journalists, we'd rather it not be, for obvious reasons. But go on, give us your conclusions then. What are we going to do about this?
My conclusion so much is that, when we talk about these things, I often think about, okay, so I'm a campaigner, right? I'm not actually a journalist by background, I'm a campaigner. So what do we do about this? How do we achieve impact? And I think one thing we have to do is constantly assess our tactics, see what's working, what's not. The thing that I have seen in recent years that I think has most promise is this idea of individual sanctions. That can be done in a number of ways. One thing I'm really excited about is Magnitsky legislation. So I'll give a very kind of brief overview of something that's quite complex, but Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian tax lawyer who worked actually for Hermitage Capital. So you may know Bill Browder, who's campaigned quite a lot for Magnitsky legislation, as have others. But Sergei was tortured and killed in a Russian prison, which inspired efforts for what became the first Magnitsky law in the United States, which was the first one was actually only applicable to Russian officials, but it was a way to hold Russian officials that were complicit in or directly involved in human rights abuses and corrupt acts. It was a way to hold them to account in the United States. That was followed by a global Magnitsky Act that could then be applied to officials from other countries. So exactly, and so this has come up again recently because there's been a move by Congress to actually apply Magnitsky sanctions towards Saudi officials in connection with the Khashoggi case. And a number of countries now have adopted Magnitsky legislation, sort of following the same principle as that global Magnitsky approach. If I'm not mistaken, Latvia is one of them. Yeah, we've got Magnitsky legislation here in the UK, which we actually very warmly welcomed. But recently, our Prime Minister stated that it won't be implemented until after Brexit. Sorry, Brexit again. But we're not very happy with that because it has nothing to do with Brexit, and actually we need to be implementing it straight away because officials that are involved in such horrific abuses should not be able to carry on with business as usual here in the United Kingdom. But it's this, and I've seen this. It's not always through Magnitsky legislation. There's other ways of achieving visa bans, sort of asset freezing, other ways of individually holding the corrupt individuals responsible for these acts to account. In Azerbaijan, we've seen even the threat of this result in release of an individual from prison. So we know it can work. I think the traditional naming and shaming that we as international NGOs will continue to do, that's kind of our bread and butter, doesn't always work in the cases of the worst offenders, but actually getting at the individuals doing this, it does. They want to come shopping in London, they want to send their kids to school, not just in London, throughout Europe and the US, and wherever, the places that they want to be, they want to send their kids to school there, they all have a backup plan, right? If you start to implement those consequences, it will work. But I think also it's this campaigning, it's these, I think in Daphne's case has reminded me of sort of how we can be most effective, and I think it's this track, these three things coming together, the continued reporting, which is what Forbidden Stories is doing, the human rights campaigning that goes parallel to that, and the legal work. What we're seeing now, in Daphne's case, I think the level of that, the momentum and the cooperation is unprecedented. The closest I've seen was a couple of years ago in the case of an Azerbaijani journalist, Hadija Ismailova, who was imprisoned and actually released earlier than I think the Azerbaijani authorities ever planned to, because we simply, all of these things together, the reporting, the campaigning and the legal work, made it too costly for them to keep her in prison. I think we need more of that, more collaboration. And sometimes these cases, as horrific as they are, can actually have a sort of an effect as a role as catalyst, if you will. I was recently talking to a good friend of mine, Azerbaijani, I think he described himself as a media manager now, Amin Milli, who is a former political prisoner himself. He started this outlet called Maidan TV, which is working in exile from outside of Azerbaijan. But he reminded me of actually what was the first case of a murder of a journalist that I worked on as well, which was Elmar Husseinov, an Azerbaijani editor who was murdered in 2005. I didn't know Elmar. Some of the Azerbaijani colleagues that I work with now didn't know him either, but it means that was his birth as a sort of somebody who then entered a career of activism and sort of media management. And for that generation of journalists and civil society activists in Azerbaijan, that was a defining moment. And as Amin said, actually there's Elmars in so many countries, and so for every case, and actually maybe even the most horrific ones like Jamal Khashoggi, there will be this sort of, this effect that those who care about democracy, that those who embody these values will actually be activated by that. And so I think that's the story, and Forbidden Stories actually captures that very well. You can't kill the message, and actually you will bring more of this down upon yourself by targeting these individuals.
Thank you. Now, I want to, before we're going to open up to some questions. Before I do, I just want you to remember Shahidul Alam. He is a journalist. On the 11th of October this year, we gave him an award, the Frontline Club Awards, and we gave him an award. He is currently in a Bangladeshi jail, and certainly shouldn't be. But I know, Peter, you wanted to talk about these guys. These are the Reuters too, on the Rohingya story. And so I thought maybe you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
I think this is a really egregious example of the kind of things that, the way in which journalism itself has been criminalised. Let's just remind ourselves of exactly what it was that these two journalists were doing. They were investigating the mass murder of 10 Rohingya men in Myanmar. And they were able to, through some really incredible investigative work, they were able to identify the men themselves, the victims, but they were also able to identify the officers, the security officers that were responsible for those murders. In the course of the investigation, the police contacted them and said, listen, we've got some information for you, come on in and we'll share that with you. They went to, the journalists went to the meeting, the police gave them some documents and immediately arrested them for violating the Official Secrets Act by handling classified documents. The journalists were imprisoned, went to trial. In the meantime, the authorities were forced to arrest the guys that were responsible for the murder. They convicted those guys and sentenced them to prison for the murders. They then carried on, and in the trial, the journalists were the police officer, one of the police officers who was involved in that set-up operation, got up in court and admitted that he was involved with it. He then was sacked from his job and has gone to prison himself. The journalists ultimately were convicted of violating the Official Secrets Act, and the sentence is longer than the guys that were responsible for the killing. I guess what Aung San Suu Kyi said about this. She said, the journalists are not in prison because of their journalism, they are there because they broke the law. Now this is exactly the kind of thing that we saw with us. This is the sort of thing that we need to be outraged about. And one of the reasons that I'm so very impressed by the work that we've just been hearing about is because we need to make the costs of imprisoning journalists higher than the costs of respecting the work that we do. We have to raise the price. That's the only reason that I'm here today, is because of the vast social media and diplomatic campaign that made it too expensive in moral and ethical and political terms for the Egyptians to hold on to us. We need to keep doing that. And I think that's the way forward. Make it too damned expensive.
Thanks, Peter. Right, I think we're going to have some questions.
You make very little reference to sub-Saharan Africa. And of course we have problems, real problems in journalism. And in fact, women are often threatened if they are dating a journalist. They'll find a proxy attack in one way or the other. Huge threats to freedom of speech. I'm just wondering if you could speak more to how that we can campus more safety there. What we're there. The fashion obviously is banning BBC and banning Sky and banning the institution, but actually that leaves the local journalists hugely threatened. I wonder if you could speak more to that.
I mean, I certainly know that when you look at, when I've looked at your figures, the imprisoned journalists map, you see China, you see Turkey, and there are lots of imprisoned journalists in Africa, aren't there?
Not as many as other regions, but there's other challenges. And so I'm not an Africa expert, so I won't try to explain actually what's going on there. Reporters Without Borders does work globally and very much in that region. That's not my particular area of expertise. But yeah, there's a range of challenges. We focus on some of the sort of surface level, the murders and the imprisonments, but there's many other issues. There's even in places like the threats of violence that is enough to keep people quiet. And so there's definitely more we can be doing there. I have struggled to get, one of my jobs here in the UK is to sort of to tell the story of our global work here to the international media here. I've struggled to get much pickup on the things I've tried to take up on Africa here. So that's something the British public actually is probably uninformed about, and we could all do better about actually getting that message out across here.
I just want to go back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you now.
Now, yeah. To Khashoggi, which is what spurred this meeting, is given the complex geopolitical situation and the economics of doing business with Saudi Arabia and everything else that's constraining governments from being really serious about consequences for the Saudi government, what would you recommend, Rebecca, as sanctions?
Well, what Reporters Without Borders is calling for is actually a freeze on all commercial ties with Saudi Arabia, and here in the UK that includes arms sales. But this is something that we've been saying for a long time. We've taken up cases here. We're out every month. In fact, since I've opened this bureau here 2 years ago, we joined English Pen in these monthly vigils for Raif Badawi, who's been imprisoned from actually nearly 6 years now. You may remember his case. He was actually flogged as well. There's long-standing cases too, so we've been calling for these things all along. I think what's happened now is there's more attention because this case is so shocking to so many that hopefully now there will be more weight. But that's something here in the UK that we can pressure government to do. I know Labour, I know Lib Dems are calling on the Conservatives to actually take this up too, so we need more political momentum. But until we increase the consequences, and especially in response to such a horrific case, Saudi's going to know that it can carry on and not suffer any real consequences in its bilateral relations.
Sorry, could I just ask one other quick question, because I think it plays into a lot of the things that you're talking about. Would you mentioned some of the 9/11 factor and so forth, but the reason these things have intensified is also because of the globalization of organized crime, it would think, and often the complicity of governments with organized crime, which we of course see in Russia and a lot of other places. But the fact that it is a syndicate, the McMafia effect, must have impact on the killings as well.
I don't know a great deal about. I mean, one of the problem. Let's go back to the question of impunity. I mean, one of the greatest difficulties is we just don't know who is behind most of these killings. So it's hard to know how much. We can surmise, we can guess that there's organised crime involved, and certainly in a lot of places like Latin America, criminal elements are directly involved. But I think that I don't have a clear solution to that until we know exactly what's going on. It's very who is responsible for it. It's very hard to take it any further. We need to be reminding people, as I said, why it is that we need to protect this stuff. It's not an easy. There is no easy solution to it.
I think the nature of international human rights law too is that obligations fall on states, right? And so we often focus our efforts on engaging with states for accountability, and some are working to root out organised crime. So the Italian example I mentioned is a good one. So there hasn't actually been an assassination of a journalist recently in Italy, but we know of so many that are constantly receiving death threats, that are receiving police protection, and then this case of Paolo Bormatti was actually foiled. That's what we would like to see the authorities doing in other places, so we're not seeing these cases of successful assassinations, but actually prevented attacks.
News kind of label that was started by Trump, and how that has impeded freedom of the press in terms of its purest form about being the platform for democracy, and how much it has impacted how the wider public on the global stage, it's not just in the United States, how it has impacted the respect for journalism. When you have a Trump rally where he is accusing the journalists of crimes, and where he is inciting his platform and his franchise, and how that has now become a difficult thing. I'm a journalist as well, and people say, well, how do you get your facts, and do you fact check? This whole label of fake news, something that hasn't been used before, I think has got to have one of the major impacts in what we as journalists need to do to uncover and find out what's going on in the world.
I'm going to address that very quickly, because we're all going to have to stop using the term fake news. We're going to have to, because of course that is the term that we are being instructed. I think we're going to have to call it disinformation from here on, if we have, or propaganda or something like that. But it is an incredibly important point. The Lugan press, the lying press, the term that Trump has used. He celebrated the bashing of a Guardian journalist only a few days ago, and I'm just wondering what you guys have to say about that. Is that what's happening to us?
I think you're absolutely right that we need to reclaim the term. We need to dump the term and deal with the more accurate descriptions and try and unpack it, because fake news, as you said, it allows, it gives space, it gives license to people to come after journalists regardless of who they are, and the work that we do. I think that's incredibly damaging, and we're seeing the effects of that right now. But that also means that we need to start having much more sophisticated discussions about disinformation, misinformation, about the corrupting effects of the internet. The internet was supposed to liberate us all. It was supposed to democratize information. It was supposed to turbocharge journalism and make us all far better informed and give us much more vibrant public debates. And in the end, what it's done is, the way it's unfolded is I think, corrupted it, made it messier, murkier, and far more difficult to engage in debates. I've been thinking a little bit more too about what you mentioned about organised crime, and the one thing I want to go back to is to say that in fact that's also why the Truth Never Dies project, I think, is so vitally important, because that's part of what we were saying earlier, that we need to raise the price to the point where the risks of the cost of killing a journalist is far too high. And if we have that kind of collaboration and cooperation, which is incredibly difficult in our industry, we by definition, journalists tend to be cantankerous individualists who don't like collaborating. But if we can work together on those kinds of projects, then it has the opportunity to push back. I also like to sorry.
We have another question, yes.
Just a quick question to all three of you. What else can be done? We discussed the campaignings, the sanctions, the education of audiences, the overall understanding of peoples that not everything that is on Facebook or Twitter is a reliable source, and so on and so forth. The companies, technology companies. I mean, there was a great report by the UK's Parliament's Digital Media and Culture Committee on looking at the effect that the digital and technology companies have, and whether there is a need for regulation, whether there is a need for direct financing of the media, or sort of seed funds or something. Are we in that stage again, that we have to consciously, as governments, as democracies, in a regulatory way, decide that this is important for us, that it's a public good?
That report was really excellent, and we were pleased with really the conclusion that actually self-regulation is the way forward. At Reporters Without Borders, what we want to avoid here is further proliferation of fake news laws, which we think actually could do more harm than good. So our answer to that has been something called the Journalism Trust Initiative that we launched, which we're actually working with stakeholders initially in Europe, but we're hoping it will expand more broadly internationally beyond that, but to develop a standard that media outlets and individual journalists and bloggers can sign up to and adhere to, that in an oversimplified way will be a bit like maybe a fair trademark for news, so that you know if you see this on something, that has gone through the professional process of journalism. So it's different than, there's so many initiatives sort of coming out at the moment. I think it stands out really because ours is the only one that's not funded by Facebook, Google, or any of the other platforms. And of course we have to engage with them for it to be effective, right? We need to actually involve the algorithms in particular in this. We want essentially this to be content that will get preferable treatment by the algorithms at some point down the road, but we think it's really important to maintain that independence financially from the platforms themselves. And it's really, we're hoping that if the industry can sort of, we will preempt this need for governments, because governments around the world are going, what can we do about this? Everybody's going, what can we do about this? But we fear that the answer is not to step in and actually legislate yet. And if we, as an industry, can sort this out, perhaps that's the way forward. So we're promoting that and trying to look for other ways to support quality independent journalism, rather than sort of engaging in the who is and who isn't a journalist, to support the good quality stuff.
Questions in the back there? Let's go for some more. Yes, let's go for that one.
Hello, thank you very much for this opportunity. My question would be from a Middle Eastern perspective, like from countries like Iraq, Turkey, and all of that. You have pro-democracy people and freedom of speech and fundamental rights. So when business stays as usual when it comes to the international norms, like for example, sanctions do not work, there's no actions taken against those governments, then what could be the implications for fundamental rights and free speech and pro-democracy people?
I mean, we've learned these lessons over time. If you don't have free speech, then and press freedom, then you don't have freedom. Period. You know, let's get back to some sort of fundamentals of human rights. The one human right that underpins all others is freedom of speech. If you can't speak freely, then there's no point having freedom of thought unless you're able to express that. There's no point in having freedom of association unless you're able to speak.
Sorry, my point was, if business stays as usual, if there is no action taken against those countries, what could be the implications for that one?
No, I understand, but what I'm trying to say is that if we stick with business as usual, then we backslide. We've seen this in Egypt. We're now in a far worse situation than we were before the revolution of 2011. And there's no sign that things are going to improve at all. I think that the trends are fairly similar elsewhere. Turkey, for all of Erdogan's blustering around the Khashoggi murder, the fact remains that Turkey is one of the world's biggest jailers of journalists. I don't know anywhere in the Middle East where things are actually improving. I'm not a Middle East expert, I hasten to add. I was only in Egypt for a couple of weeks before I was arrested. I have inside understanding, but that's the wrong kind of insight.
I think the consequence is that press freedom and broader human rights are deteriorating everywhere. This is one reason I actually work so much on holding the UK to the same account, and that gets a lot of sort of feedback here. It's like, okay, so the UK is 40th out of 180 countries on our World Press Freedom Index. I get asked all the time why. We talk about this a lot, and the reason that we also spend this energy holding countries like the UK to account is because that has a knock-on impact elsewhere. How can we talk about these violations in other places when standards are slipping here too? So in our World Press Freedom Index, we saw a global decline, a significant global decline in 2016, and that hasn't recovered. This is really, really a problem everywhere. So I think we agree with you in terms of we're trying to change that so it's not business continuing as usual, but that also means interacting with Western governments too and holding ourselves to the same standards. And then also calling on them in their relations with other countries that might not listen to NGOs like us, actually to increase consequences there too.
Okay, can we do 3 questions at once because we're running out of time? In fact, we'll do 3 questions at once. See if we can get everybody in.
Just very quickly, following up on Egypt and the Middle East and Al Jazeera, how important do you think it is, and what could the outlook be? We've got to this situation where Al Jazeera, 2011, 2013, certainly in Egypt, was seen as quite a reliable source that ordinary Egyptians would go to, and then it's now ended up, it's this geopolitical football used as a demand against Qatar and the Saudi blockade and so forth. What's the future for any sort of respected, free, relatively free organisation growing up elsewhere in the Middle East, or is the Al Jazeera issue something that needs to be resolved?
I think the Al Jazeera issue clearly needs to be resolved, but the problem is that any news organisation that is based in any particular country within the Middle East is going to be seen as partisan. It doesn't matter whether it is editorially independent or not. It is going to be seen as representing particular interests around where it's based. That complicates things for that particular news organisation, whether it's Al Jazeera or any other, and it doesn't make it easy. It's going to be a football. I don't quite know again what the solution is.